Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 114 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today's episode is another solo episode where I share some of my own research with you. You may remember episode 76, titled Death and the Dangers of Clandestine Work, where I discussed 4 stories of mysterious deaths from the world of espionage. So today I'm back with 4 more mysterious deaths that are still debated by some people to this very day. This type of episode and this type of story has been very popular, so hopefully after this you will hear a few more of these in the near future as well. But before we get into these stories, I want to say a big thank you to everyone listening who is also supporting me on Patreon, including Max E. and Andy H. Your monthly contributions there help me keep this podcast going week in and week out. As a way of thanking my patrons, I offer a lot of great freebies and promotions, including free and discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. Patrons also get exclusive access to long-form articles of mine that aren't available anywhere else. If you haven't signed up for my Patreon yet, but you want to, just click the link in the show notes on whatever podcast platform you're listening to right now. The first case comes from Germany near the end of the Cold War. A German politician named Uwe Barschel was discovered dead in his hotel room bathtub by a reporter in Geneva, Switzerland in October 1987. Barschel served as the premier of the northern German state of Schleswig-Holstein in the 5 years leading up to his death. A premier is the equivalent to a state governor here in the U.S. He was also the youngest ever premier in Germany, having taken office at age 38 in 1982. He was a fast-rising star in West Germany's Christian Democratic Union political party and was probably destined for greater things one day. But 5 years later, in the fall of 1987, his political career came completely undone in the face of a major scandal. Barschel's media aide, named Rainer Pfeiffer, publicly accused him of hiring a private detective to spy on the opposing candidate, Bjorn Ingem, of the Social Democratic Party. Pfeiffer said he'd been tasked to plant a false story accusing Ingem of tax fraud via an anonymous letter, also to look for any indicators of homosexual activity, and even to plant a bug in Ingem's telephone, if possible. The story broke in Der Spiegel just hours before electoral polls opened and was referred to as Waterkant-gate, a play on the very famous Watergate scandal from the Nixon presidency in America. It's probably not surprising that the voting results that day were disastrous for Barschel. He resigned from office on September 25th, 1987, and quickly departed the country on vacation with his family to the Canary Islands, and then later to Geneva, Switzerland. On the morning of October 10th, a reporter approached his room at the Beau Rivage Hotel for an interview and found the door slightly ajar, and Barschel dead in the bathtub, still fully clothed. A postmortem toxicology report revealed the presence of 8 different drugs, including lorazepam, diazepam, and cyclobarbital. His death was later ruled a suicide by Swiss police, leading to widespread criticism and a host of competing theories as to who might have killed him and why. It's certainly true that Barschel's life had come apart at the seams in a very short period of time. That is exactly the kind of thing that has driven many people to take their own lives in the past. And his use of multiple sedatives was, in fact, in line with a guide which had recently been published by a German Right to Die organization. So he may have followed those recommendations in order to slip away peacefully. But I wouldn't be talking about his death here if I thought it was just another suicide. One major lingering question was the disappearance of a bottle of red wine. Barschel ordered the bottle via room service, but it was nowhere to be found after the reporter alerted police to his death, hinting that someone else had been in the room, of course. Potential culprits have included the East German STB, the Iranian government, or perhaps the Israeli Mossad. The Mossad may have had an interest in Barschel because he allegedly refused to allow Iranian pilots to train near the state capital of Kiel as part of Israeli efforts to prolong the Iran-Iraq War of that era. In 1994, Swiss toxicologist Hans Brandenburger announced that the lethal dose of cyclobarbital had likely been ingested after Barschel had already passed out from the other drugs he'd taken, indicating at least one other person was involved in his death. In 2010, nearly 24 years after his death, Barschel's case was reopened by prosecutors to allow for a forensic examination of his clothing using recently developed techniques and technology. To date, no one has ever been charged in his murder, and no definitive determination has been made whether he was murdered at all. Another case that is still a matter of debate after more than 75 years is the death of Czechoslovakia's foreign minister, Jan Masaryk, who was found dead in the courtyard below his apartment in March 1948, just 2 weeks after a Soviet-backed coup d'etat deposed the previous government. At the time of his death, Masaryk was the only remaining non-communist senior minister in the Czechoslovakian government. He was the son of Czechoslovakia's first president, Tomáš Masaryk, and spent years working in the United States in his youth and spoke English with an American accent. In 1915, he had joined the Austro-Hungarian army, but did not serve on the front lines during the First World War because he was considered politically unreliable. Afterwards, he became a secretary in Czechoslovakia's foreign ministry and served for 13 years as their ambassador to the United Kingdom. He then served as the foreign minister with the government in exile, which was also based in London, after Germany annexed and occupied Czechoslovakia in 1938. He remained in that position all through the Second World War and into the early post-war period, when Soviet troops were occupying his country and began exerting control over the populace, just as they did in Poland, the eastern portion of Germany, and everywhere else. Masaryk was considered to be a very skillful minister and had some initial success with staving off Soviet control over the country. He did not want to give them an excuse that they needed to take over based on threats from the Czech government or population. But by 1947, his efforts and those of the other non-communist members of the government were falling apart. The U.S. responded to Soviet influence over Eastern Europe with the Marshall Plan, which was a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar aid package for post-war reconstruction and economic assistance throughout Europe. Masaryk and other government ministers indicated they were interested in taking part in an agreement with the U.S. and might have potentially received as much as $200 million if approved. But that was enough to convince the Soviets to take more drastic measures in Czechoslovakia. Masaryk and a few others attended talks in Moscow in July 1947, and he was overheard on his return stating, quote, I went to Moscow as a Czechoslovak minister, and I returned as Stalin's servant." Unquote. The country was pressured into declining to participate in the Marshall Plan and never received any reconstruction funds. By early 1948, the Czech Communist Party had already succeeded in filling the ranks of the police force with communist hardliners. In late February, mass demonstrations were mounted across the country, supported by the police. Facing a potential civil war, President Edvard Beneš allowed the Communist Party to form a new government, which quickly consolidated power and took control of upcoming elections. In response, all the cabinet members resigned from their positions, with the exception of Jan Masaryk. On the morning of March 10th, Masaryk's body was found below the bathroom window of his apartment in Chernin Palace, the home of the Foreign Ministry. He had fallen 45 feet to the stone courtyard and was still wearing his bathrobe. The new government, under the leadership of Communist Party General Secretary Klement Gottwald, quickly declared that Masaryk died by suicide. Just the day before his shocking death, Masaryk gave a media interview in which he gave no apparent indications that he might be despondent or suicidal. But the journalist, Stefan Szymanski, later published an article just 2 days later stating that Masaryk was essentially confined to this apartment in the Foreign Ministry building. All the Foreign Ministry employees were brand new hires, all presumably ideologically aligned with the Communist Party. In the 2 weeks prior to that particular interview, everything Masaryk had stated or written had been censored by the new government. And, perhaps most interestingly of all, on the day of his death, he was scheduled to speak in front of the new Czech parliament for the first time since the coup d'etat. So it's very possible that he would have protested or criticized the new government in some way, and that they refused to tolerate the possibility. However, I should also note that the coup itself and his mistreatment afterwards could possibly have driven him to suicide on their own. He had watched as his life's work was completely undone in the space of a few violent weeks, and his own father's legacy was completely erased. That would certainly drive even a very resilient man into despair. So we can't ignore the possibility that he did, in fact, kill himself, although I still think that's the less likely scenario, all things considered. Masaryk received a state funeral procession, and thousands of people turned out to watch as his casket was wheeled through the streets and across the world-famous Charles River Bridge. But virtually no one, at the time, believed that he died because it was what he had wanted. Nearly 2 years later, in January 1950, a foreign ministry official named Jan Bidowski confessed to police that he and Colonel František Frick had pushed Masaryk out of his window. They believed they were doing so at the behest of the British Secret Intelligence Service, for whom they had worked during the war. But Masaryk's death was likely ordered by the Soviet NKVD in a false flag operation. Bidowski later recanted his confession, saying it had been extracted under duress. Masaryk's death was debated for decades to come, and a police inquiry in 2004 determined that he had likely been pushed out of the window. Masaryk landed more than 2 meters away from the building and landed on his feet. Both were potential indicators that he had been pushed and attempted to save himself as he fell. I don't think that after all this time there will ever be a consensus on what actually happened that morning, but considering the many other times when Stalin's perceived enemies were thrown out of windows over the years, it's hard to come to any other conclusion about Jan Masaryk's final moments. Next, I want to share with you a story from Washington, D.C., the murder of Mary Pinchot Meyer. In October 1964, Meyer was killed in broad daylight on her daily walk in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. She was shot in the heart and head at extreme close range. Several people overheard her shouting, followed by 2 gunshots, but no one came forward as an eyewitness to the actual killing. However, a search by the police of the immediate area turned up Raymond Crump, whose clothing was soaking wet and who had a cut on his hand. Crump claimed he was at the river fishing that day, although his fishing rod was later found back at home. He was tried the following year for Meyer's murder, but acquitted due to a lack of evidence, and no murder weapon was ever recovered. Meyer was more than just an innocent victim caught at the wrong place at the wrong time. Far more, in fact. She was the ex-wife of Cord Meyer, a senior member of the CIA's Office of Policy Coordination under the leadership of Frank Wisner. Wisner's department was responsible for the CIA's direct action throughout the first half of the Cold War. It was Wisner who directed the targeted killings, the sabotage, and the black operations for which the CIA would be forever known. Cord Meyer himself has been described as the principal operative for Operation Mockingbird, which influenced and steered the publication of news stories of dozens of media outlets from 1951 on. Meyer and other participants in Operation Mockingbird used various methods to influence the media, including bribes paid to journalists, appeals to their patriotic nature, and the sharing of classified information with cooperative writers and editors. Mary and Cord Meyer were married in 1945 while he was in the U.S. recovering from wounds he received on Guam while serving as a Marine. Cord was recruited into the CIA by Allen Dulles in 1950, while Mary worked as a journalist for several different publications until after the birth of her second son, at which point she became a housewife and socialite. The couple divorced in 1958, a year after the death of their son Michael, who was struck by a car outside their home. Mary was also a former mistress of President John F. Kennedy, who had just been assassinated less than 1 year earlier. The two had first met in high school in the 1930s when Kennedy attended the Choate School for Boys in Wallingford, Connecticut. After the Kennedys moved into the Hickory Hill house near the Meyers in 1954, while Kennedy was still a senator, Jackie and Mary became close friends and would walk together along the towpath beside the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal in Georgetown every day. It was on this very same towpath that Mary was murdered. After Mary's divorce from Cord Meyer, she began visiting the president when Jackie was out of town. She was just one of many of Kennedy's mistresses, but one who had been in his life for the longest. The day after her shocking death, Mary's sister, Antoinette, went to her home to retrieve her personal diary. Mary had told a friend that if anything happened to her, her diary should be destroyed. After entering the house, Antoinette found James Jesus Angleton, the chief of counterintelligence at the CIA, already inside and searching for the diary as well. Mary's sister and her husband, Ben Bradley, found the diary and gave it to Angleton, who burned it. Mary's untimely death and her relationship with both the CIA and President Kennedy have spurred decades of question over the CIA's possible role in both their deaths, and it's unlikely that those questions will ever be fully answered. In fact, as you may have noticed, that is often the conclusion for so many of the stories that we cover here on this podcast. The final story for today comes from Scotland, which I almost never cover here on the show. Early one morning in April 1985, a well-known attorney from Glasgow named Willie McRae was found in his crashed vehicle on the side of the road, close to death. For decades afterward, people would continue to debate what really happened to him the night before he was found. Willie McRae had been involved in political and legal advocacy for various left-wing causes from a very young age. He was born in 1923 in northern Scotland and was just 16 years old when the Second World War began. Although he was underage, he enlisted with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders Regiment and fought in France, where he was wounded in battle. He was evacuated along with hundreds of thousands of other troops at Dunkirk, but once he arrived back in England, it was discovered that he was underage, and he was discharged from service after recovering from his wounds. But he was undeterred, so he joined the Royal Indian Navy, which was still part of the UK at the time, and served in naval intelligence. In fact, he learned to speak Urdu as part of his duties. Are you an amateur military historian like me? Has this podcast rekindled your interest in Eastern Europe and the Cold War? Maybe you're finally getting into reenacting and living history, just like you've always said you would. If so, you should check out the incredible collection of surplus military goods at krashiki.com. Kruss himself scours the continent for the best uniforms and field equipment available and delivers them right to your door. He's got almost anything you can imagine and many things you haven't. Uniforms from East Germany, the Soviet Union, and modern-day Bulgaria, Poland, and Russia are all available. Rucksacks, mess kits, and load-bearing gear are also up on the site right now. The inventory is constantly changing, so you never know what kind of gems you might stumble on, all at very affordable prices. Find it all at krashiki.com. That's KRUSCHIKI.com. And use the discount code Spycraft101 for 10% off your order. After the war ended, he remained for a time in India and began advocating for their independence. He even became friends with Indira Gandhi, who would later become India's first and only female prime minister to date. However, as a Scotsman who was advocating for Indian independence, he very quickly came to the attention of Special Branch, which investigated political and terroristic threats throughout the kingdom and its colonies. He remained under varying levels of surveillance for the remainder of his life. But Indian independence was just the first of many causes that he would champion over the years. After returning to Scotland, he joined a law firm run by an attorney named Abraham Levy. He soon became involved with legal and political affairs in Israel when it declared independence in 1947, and he even helped write their commerce laws. He was such a friend to Israel in that country's earliest days that he was named a professor emeritus at Haifa University, and there is now a grove of trees planted and a plaque installed in his honor in the small town of Migdal HaEmek near Nazareth. But more than any other international cause, Willie McRae was committed to Scottish independence and land rights. For many years, he worked tirelessly to prevent any nuclear waste from being dumped at designated sites in Scotland. He was instrumental in stopping the creation of at least one site in the Ayrshire Hills in the southwest, and has been described as the nuclear industry's most capable adversary in Scotland during his lifetime. Several other people involved in protesting the nuclear industry were also apparently targeted to one degree or another in the early 1980s. An activist organization called the Scottish Campaign to Resist Atomic Menace, or SCRAM, had their offices broken into and set on fire. Another activist named Dora Russell suffered a break-in at home and had to fight off 2 intruders. And a woman named Hilda Morell was kidnapped and killed in March 1984. A man named Andrew George was finally convicted of her murder in 2003. He'd been a teenager at the time, and although the conviction has since been upheld, some people still believe he was the fall guy for a larger conspiracy. Besides environmentalism, McRae also served as a vice chairman for the Scottish National Party, and even acted as a defense attorney for members of the Scottish National Liberation Army, also sometimes referred to as the Tartan Terrorists. They were a small terror group active in the early 1980s. The SNLA sent dozens of letter bombs to government figures including Princess Diana and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher during that time period. After McRae's death, the founder of the SNLA, Adam Busby, claimed that his support had gone far beyond standard legal defense. Busby also served in the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders Regiment, just as McRae had many years earlier. He said that McRae had provided money for himself and one other man to escape to Dublin, Ireland, as a means to avoid arrest and prosecution in Scotland, and that McRae had even let them stay in his cabin in Kintail. Busby wasn't arrested until 1997, 14 years after he'd sent the first letter bombs. I think it's safe to say that if Busby was telling the truth about McRae, then his collaboration with the SNLA would have certainly raised his profile even further with Special Branch and MI5. But even before that, in 1980, during a speech advocating against a nuclear waste site, McRae stated, quote, "Nuclear waste should be stored in the same place where Guy Fawkes stored his gunpowder," unquote. That was a reference to the famous gunpowder plot of November 5th, 1605, when Guy Fawkes placed barrels of gunpowder directly beneath the House of Lords in London with the intention of blowing up Parliament. A statement like that probably put him on yet another list with Special Branch, who were already well aware of him by that time, of course. In fact, we know now that he was under surveillance around the time of his death because he had taken down the license plate of a car that he'd recently spotted following him. That plate number, XSJ432T, was one owned by Special Branch, as it was determined later on. On April 5th, 1985, McRae left his office to drive to his cabin in Kintail, but he never arrived. The following day, several drivers stopped on the highway to render aid after seeing his damaged Volvo sedan in a field well off the side of the highway. The car was tilted over in the rough terrain, which meant that the driver's side door was mostly wedged shut and could only be opened about 12 inches. The people who found him asked another driver to alert the authorities in the nearest town, and about an hour later, police and an ambulance arrived on the scene. One of the drivers who had stopped was David Coutts, who was a councillor for the Scottish National Party and who had immediately recognized McRae since they had both been in the same social circles. He also found a small pile of paper documents which had been hand-shredded near the vehicle. On top of it was McRae's wristwatch. The face of the wristwatch had been smashed. McRae was still in the driver's seat where he'd likely been overnight, covered in blood and barely breathing, after what was initially presumed to be a car accident. Several hours after McRae was transported to the hospital, a nurse was cleaning blood out of his hair when she realized there was a gunshot wound in his right temple above his ear, changing the perception of the situation completely. A bullet was still lodged in his brain where it had ricocheted around inside his skull, doing terrible damage. McRae passed away the following day after being removed from life support, approximately 36 hours after he was shot. From there, the investigation turned into a debacle that has been heavily criticized for nearly 40 years. The police closed their investigation within 48 hours, declaring it a suicide, which meant it really wasn't an investigation at all. There was no meaningful forensic evidence recovered or evaluated, and the vehicle was quickly removed from the scene. For many years afterwards, they refused to open a fatal accident inquiry, which was the Scottish legal equivalent of a coroner's inquest. Journalists and documentary filmmakers took it upon themselves to investigate his death, and always found more questions than answers. For one thing, his many friends, family members, and associates gave widely varying accounts of his mental health and stated plans. Some people said that he had recently been despondent. Willie had battled alcohol addiction for many years and, in fact, had recently been cited for driving under the influence for the second time. In fact, just the day before his final, fatal journey, he'd accidentally started a fire in his bedroom by smoking a cigarette while lying in bed. The fire department had even been called, although fortunately the fire didn't cause too much damage. But other people said he'd recently been re-energized by his work and was happier than they'd seen him in a long time. An antiquated Smith & Wesson revolver was found between 45 and 60 feet away from the car, with no explanation as to how McRae might have tossed it after shooting himself. It was also apparent that 2 rounds had been fired from the revolver, but there was no explanation as to what might have happened to the other round. Not only that, but there had been no telltale powder burns on McRae's head, which would have been typical of a shot fired at extremely close range. That was one reason why the bullet wound was initially missed. A few minutes after police had first arrived on the scene, a gust of wind blew an officer's hat off of his head, and David Coots crawled under McRae's crashed vehicle to retrieve it. He would later say he hadn't seen anything else underneath the car. But 5 years later, Scotland's Solicitor General wrote a letter to a member of Parliament stating that McRae's revolver was found directly under the vehicle, where he would have dropped it if he'd fired a bullet into his own head with the door slightly open. Furthermore, McRae never went anywhere without his briefcases in which he kept documents related to whatever he was working on at the time. In April of 1985, he was working to prevent the dumping of nuclear waste into the ocean near the Dunray Nuclear Power Development Establishment in northern Scotland. But neither of his 2 briefcases were seen at the accident site by David Coots or the other Samaritans who stopped to help. However, police later gave both of the briefcases to McRae's brother, along with other personal items from his car. So where did they get the briefcases? And what happened to the contents in the interim? And, interestingly enough, McRae's office was also burgled just before his death, and the only thing stolen were additional papers related to the Dunray nuclear site. In November 2021, a retired police officer from Glasgow named Donald Morrison made some startling claims to British media. He worked in Glasgow from the 1970s through the 1990s and was very familiar with McRae. He claimed that McRae's first drunk driving arrest was initiated by Special Branch because they witnessed him driving erratically while they were following him one night. After McRae was taken into custody, Special Branch officers made copies of his keys, which were confiscated along with his other personal belongings that night. They later used those keys to break into his office repeatedly over the next few years. Morrison claimed this was a very common tactic of that era and that Special Branch did this to many other people taken into custody as well. Besides the varying reports on his mental health in the days leading up to the crash, McRae had also made some very interesting statements to several people about his current projects. On several occasions, he said something to the effect of, "I finally got them," but refused to elaborate on who exactly he had gotten. Most people took it to mean he was referring to people involved with the nuclear establishment at Dunray. Some people believed he'd been handed classified documents by a whistleblower or insider within the Dunray site. But there has been some speculation since then that he might have been referring to something or someone altogether different. One of McRae's oldest friends, David Blair, claimed in 2014 that McRae had somehow acquired a list containing the names of senior government and political figures in Scotland who visited the infamous Elm Guest House in the early 1980s. The Elm Guest House is now known to have been a gathering place for pedophiles, with young boys being trafficked in and abused there, and the resulting scandal has been a major source of attention for the past few years, as various people in government and high social circles in Scotland have been accused of frequenting the guest house. It's not clear at all if McRae actually had a list of names from the guest house or how he would have acquired it. But if he did, that would have been a very clear motivation for some people to obfuscate the circumstances of his death. Willie McRae's story is still making headlines even now, nearly 40 years later. But I don't think that we are any closer to the truth now than they were in the first few weeks and months after his death. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my pages on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.